Shabbat Shalom. One of the exciting things that I love to think about is, why do we start new things? What's the deal with new beginnings? Well, when we look at psychology, it kind of teaches us that when we go ahead and start something new, there's a few reasons that we do it. Maybe we're in pain, like we were just diagnosed with diabetes and we have to change our diet. Oi. Maybe we have this great desire. We want to improve ourselves, make ourselves the best that we can be. How fun is that? Or maybe we're just kind of tired of living in the same loop and seeing the same things just happen again and again. It's not really pain, it's not desire to change, but we really need to do something if we're going to go ahead and make it better. Well, we kind of have an opportunity whenever we're at a new beginning. We can look around and see life is like a blank canvas, and we can kind of paint whatever picture we so choose on that canvas. And I want us to think about, though, and recognize that sometimes it's a little bit challenging to go ahead and paint that canvas. Sometimes there are things in our way that kind of block us, even when we know we need to change, even when we want to make things better. Peter Sheehan, an author, speaker, and CEO of Change Labs, who has done a lot of work with Apple and IBM on behavioral change products, said regarding change, the secret killer of innovation is shame. You can't measure it, but it's there. Every time someone holds back on a new idea, fails to give their manager the much needed feedback, is afraid to speak up in front of a client, you can be sure that shame has played a part of it. That deep fear we all have of being wrong, of being belittled, of feeling less than, is what stops us from taking the very risks required to move our companies forward. If you want a culture of creativity and innovation, he says, where sensible risks are embraced on both a market and individual level, start by developing the ability of managers to cultivate an openness to vulnerability in their teams. And this, paradoxically perhaps, requires first that they be vulnerable themselves. This notion that a leader needs to be in charge, that they need to know it all, is both dated and destructive. Its impact on others is the sense that they know less, they are less, and is a recipe for risk aversion, if I ever heard of one. Shame becomes fear. Fear leads to risk aversion. Risk aversion kills innovation. The bottom line is that daring greatly, choosing to break out of that, requires worthiness. And shame tells us and sends us into a feeling that we may not really be worthy. And I want to throw that out there, that it takes courage to make change. It takes a fearlessness to recognize that blank canvas is an opportunity. When we think about the authors of the book of Deuteronomy, they had an opportunity. Some say that book may have been written after the destruction of the first temple, but what opportunity they had was to craft, in many ways, their version of a great society. What would you throw on a great society? And I just ask, you don't have to answer the question, but you can kind of think in your brains. What would constitute a great society even? What would that look like? And yes, I might be referring to President Johnson. After all, he is one of my favorite doers of all presidents. He did a lot of things, but not everybody has to agree with that assessment of who he was. I want to look at it specifically, though, in regards to this week's Parshat Re'eh, and that it opens with this wonderful ritual, and we see blessings being shouted out from Har Gerizim and curses from Har Ebal, and the people kind of going on in between, listening and recognizing that if they follow God's path, good things are going to happen, and if they don't, bad things are going to happen and curses will happen. what an interesting way to mark a transition point. Well, we may not necessarily agree with the blessings and the curses. It's a wonderful ritual to connotate or demonstrate, hey, we're beginning something new. We're celebrating something. Weddings do the same thing. Weddings are the transitional state between two separate people having a ritual celebration, heading off into a marriage, a journey of them together. The next thing that we know happened in the ancient Near East is an interesting ritual. When kings would ascend to the throne, they would sometimes grant a one-time canceling of debts, a returning of land that was confiscated by the crown, and a freeing of slaves or indentured servants. Even the Akkadian word doraru is reflective of the Hebrew word deror, or jubilee, or release, as described also in Leviticus, mentioned in Jeremiah, and referred to in this passage. What the innovation was that the Deuteronomic author wasn't just canceling out debts to cancel debts as a celebratory moment. He regulated it every 7 years, every 50 years. A recognition that in a good society, in their mind, it's not just that it's one new beginning, but it's multiple opportunities for people to achieve their best. And if they're stuck in debt, they can't necessarily do that. The next thing that I think is fascinating, again, also in this week's Parsha, is the centralization of the temple. We can imagine and understand people would worship in their own homes, in their own little way, all over the place. But what the Deuteronomic author said, it really, maybe it was King Josiah when he uncovered the book of Deuteronomy, it's described in 2 Kings, so I'll leave that to your educated mind to decide, was that home sanctuaries and individual worship, that's not where it's at. We need to be centralized. We need to have a central voice, a central authority. In many regards, what he was advocating and arguing was for centralized government. Because after all, what was the job of the temple? It wasn't just worshiping God, but tithes were given, taxes were taken for the benefit of the society. And lastly, we can really see that these are the major reforms. This was the blank canvas that the Deuteronomic author intended to write on, intended to make awesome, and intended to bestow upon us. And I think it's up to us to continue to pick up the brush that he or she laid down and craft that good society, a society which answers to the needs of the poor, addresses the fact that we need to sometimes have a centralized rule or agencies, that we do need to have ritual in our lives to help set bookends and markate out specific things. But ultimately, it's really, we can craft that positive, great society when we choose to work together harmoniously for the benefit of everyone. Kenny Yiratzon, may this be God's will.